So let's go ahead and get back to our lecture here. So last time we were talking about the respiratory system in terms of extreme environments. One extreme environment we're talking about is a near drowning experience, right? And we're also talking about premature babies. In both cases, you may not have sufficient surfactant on the alveoli of your lungs, remember? Are you not seeing it switch? Okay, let me just pull this up again and do. I saw some confused faces, so I'm guessing he wasn't sharing right. Okay, so lungs of premature babies, right? They're not producing surfactant yet. Near drowning can wash away the surfactant from the alveoli. Are you guys seeing this okay now? Okay. All right. And so we talked about how if you could fill the lungs and the alveoli with fluid, right, how that could force those alveoli, those sacs open again. So it's like a plastic grocery bag, but you're filling it with fluid, so it forces it open again, bulging again. So I told you guys to think about this and come back with answers. So why can we not breathe underwater? So tell me what you think here.
Well, as warm-blooded animals, endotherms, we have higher oxygen demands, and water just doesn't have enough oxygen to satisfy that.
Okay, so we have a lack of oxygen in the water. What else? Anybody else have any other thoughts?
Our breathing mechanisms are not designed to move water.
Okay, so water is tough to move, so we're not designed to breathe to move water in and out of our lungs, right? What else? Anything else? Anything else that we have to do to breathe? Or why, and any other reason, I should say, why we breathe? Do you know what actually triggers you to breathe? Normally, under normal circumstances? It's not a lack of oxygen.
Isn't it the buildup of CO2?
It's the buildup of CO2. So what else might be problematic with breathing underwater?
Oh, you can't get rid of CO2.
Okay,
Well,
yeah, so even though CO2 dissolves better in water than O2, you can't get rid of it as easily as in air. So all of those answers are correct, and we'll talk about them here, okay? So first of all, water doesn't deliver sufficient amounts of oxygen per rate at which we can move it in and out of our lungs, right? Because it's going to be hard to move that fluid in and out of our lungs, not as quickly as air, right? So people were doing research into this to try to figure this out, okay? And what they did is they took rodents. So you can see fish in here in this fluid, right? They're surviving in there. They took rodents and they put them into this fluid, and they thought, okay, well, you can't get enough oxygen from regular water, so let's supersaturate the water over here with oxygen. Okay, so they supersaturated it, and it's funny, it keeps showing me, she keeps showing Greta up here instead of me. I gotta change some of these options so it shows me in the corner there. But they found that the mice, even though there was enough oxygen in that water, they could still not survive. Okay, they weren't able to, because of the viscosity of water, circulate enough of it in and out of their lungs to get rid of sufficient CO2. So even though there was enough O2, because of some of these methods, artificial methods they used to supersaturate the water with oxygen, and you could deliver sufficient oxygen, you still could not move the water fast enough to discharge your CO2 from your body, so those rodents still died. Okay, so even though CO2 dissolves more readily in water than does O2, it's still not sufficient to allow for sufficient expulsion from the body into liquid at the rate liquid can be ventilated. Okay, so next what they did is they switched from water to using another alternative fluid. And they used perfluorocarbons, PFCs for short. Okay, this is kind of a carbon and fluorine mix in a liquid form. Okay, you can just see some structure here. You don't have to memorize that or anything. This is just in case you're interested. And so instead of hydrogens, it's got fluorines on the carbon here. And this fluid here is much more able to dissolve oxygen and CO2 within it, okay? Oxygen can concentrate in some perfluorocarbons higher than it can in air, actually. So it could be super rich in oxygen, and it could dissolve CO2 sufficiently to keep animals alive, okay? So you could put them in that perfluorocarbon and keep those rodents alive. When you took them out of that fluid, you could drain it from their lungs and it evaporates very quickly, and so those animals could get back to breathing air. And so the mice would survive this. You know, it does take a bit of a toll on the lung tissues, which are used to just air medium there and not a liquid medium, which could kind of damage some of those epithelial cells there. Now, I had this pulled up on the desktop, which wasn't working, so let's pull it up again here. So, you know, why could, so first I pull up a little question for you. Why could a liquid be good for diving to low depths like they do in movies like The Abyss here?
It can maybe like resist the pressure of the water on top of you to have water inside of you.
Yeah, it's hard to compress water, right? So we're going to talk about diving, and when you go deep underwater, how pressure increases, right? We've already mentioned how up high on mountains air is thin because pressure is so low, right? So those air molecules expand away from each other, and there's not a high concentration of them. Well, underwater, there's a high concentration, there's lots of pressure, can cause a buildup of gases in your lungs when you're breathing through a scuba system like this, right? And we'll talk about how that could lead to decompression sickness, aka the bends, right? But if you're breathing a liquid doesn't compress as easily as a gas, so you wouldn't have that same buildup. Now, this is a clip from the movie The Abyss. Have any of you guys seen The Abyss? It's a while back now, a couple of you? Okay. So let's bring this up, and then I might have to change the screen share here to do this.
You use it when you go really deep.
How deep?
Deep.
How deep?
So this is from a movie, and they got a lot of criticism because they actually used a real animal in this demonstration you're about to see in this movie.
Oxygenated fluorocarbon emulsion.
Bullshit. Check this out. Can I borrow your rat? What are you doing? Hey, no. You're gonna kill her!
It's okay, I've done this myself.
Oh, man, what are you just drowning her?
She's gonna be fine. I breathed this myself. Gonna be fine.
No, man, she's gonna drown. Look, she's freaking out.
Just going through a normal adjustment period.
Normal? Does this look normal to you? She's gonna drown.
He's taking the fluid into his lungs. He's taking the fluid into his lungs. There he goes. So there's a bit of anxiety here. Now he's starting to relax. He's breathing fine. See his chest moving? Getting plenty of oxygen.
Damn rat's breathing that shit. That is no bullshit, hands down, the goddamnest thing I ever saw.
See, the fluid's harder to push in and out than air. It's a little more work to breathe. But he's doing fine. He's digging it.
She's doing it. She ain't digging it. All right, let her out. Now. Now!
Okay, all right. Okay, now we let the fluid drain from his lungs.
All right, give it here. Give it.
There's your rat. See, he's fine. It's a she.
Yeah, so that's a real example of this that they, as I said, used in a movie, and hence got a lot of slack for that, because movies are trying not to kind of cause animal distress, right? And obviously the rat in this movie was a little distressed, but it was fine from this experience. Okay, so you guys could see that okay? Could you hear it okay too? Yeah, okay. Here's one more kind of clip here to show you guys.
Mouse can survive unharmed for hours, completely submerged. The mouse is breathing a special highly oxygenated liquid chemical compound. As mammals, mice and men have evolved to extract life-sustaining oxygen from the air, but our cells, and the mouses, will take oxygen any way that they can get it. There's lots of oxygen in water. They don't call it H2O for nothing.
Okay, so even the science shows get pretty sappy with that stuff, and there's not really that much oxygen in water. But anyhow, this is real stuff. So it's interesting, and it makes you think. Okay, so maybe there's applicability with diving, right? Well, maybe there's other applicability too, right? So let me go back to here.
You said it takes a toll on the lungs.
Yeah.
Like how bad is it?
Well, you wouldn't want to do this over and over every day, right? So you could survive it, but you know it's going to start causing some epithelial cell damage and sloughing those cells off, and you need to replace them. And you know it'll be okay, but you just don't want to be doing it regularly. Okay. So first of all, when you're underwater, we talked about how liquid doesn't compress like air, so this would eliminate certain pressure problems, right? Then, you know, what's the problem with liquid, assuming it's not harmful to lungs, right? So first of all, it can cause damage. What else is another problem here?
Well, we talked about surfactant before.
Okay, so it would wash away surfactant, but it would replace its role by expanding the lungs, right? But what would be the trouble if I kind of put you into this stuff? Could you just keep breathing it?
No, it's gonna be super hard to breathe that.
It's going to be hard to breathe. You're going to tire very quickly, right? So your diaphragm's not used to pumping the fluid. So you can do it for a short time, but you're going to become exhausted, right? So what is able, sorry, somebody just crashed out and is coming back in, so let me let them in. Okay, so what is able to allow you to breathe, to replace your diaphragm and help you breathe in certain cases? That's been in the news a lot.
Ventilators.
Ventilators, right? And so, you know, breathing liquid has high metabolic costs. You wouldn't be able to maintain it without an external ventilator, okay? If a ventilator is available, there are actually liquid ventilators out there that can allow you to use PFCs like this with premature babies with underdeveloped lungs when they don't have that surfactant there, right? Or, for example, those near drowning victims that we talked about that lack surfactant. So in this case, you wouldn't be using an air ventilator like you hear about in the news. What this is doing is it's a partial liquid ventilator here that pumps the PFCs into the lungs of these patients to help open up those alveoli, wash out particulates they may have inhaled during that drowning experience, and basically sustain them, keep them alive. So it's not just science fiction movies. This stuff is actually being used to some degree in the medical community as well. Okay. Okay. Any questions about that before we move to the next topic?
I have a question on that, just with the premature babies. Wouldn't that become dangerous though, 'cause as their lungs develop, like if they're premature, their lungs aren't developed safe to do that, but when they develop, then wouldn't they like develop differently because they're used to the liquid, but it's not?
Yeah, they wouldn't keep them on that for an extensive period of time, I don't believe. I'm not sure exactly if they can switch it out and put in some sort of artificial surfactant or not, or if they could do it for a short amount, you know, for a short enough amount of time until the surfactant is released naturally. You know, that will happen fairly early on. So I'm guessing it would only be maximally like a week or two, and then the body would start naturally producing the surfactant, and you could switch them out of that. So I haven't researched, you know, the specifics on when it's used and for how long, so I don't know about that, but I'm guessing it wouldn't be very long term.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Yeah. Do people have to be like knocked out if PFCs being inserted into their lungs?
I'm guessing they have to be knocked out. Concerning with the regular ventilators, they have to be in an induced coma state with those as well. So, yeah. Yeah. And those are heavy drugs, because when you read about people coming out off those ventilators, they're in a kind of state of disorientation sometimes for a week or two afterwards because of all that medication. So it's pretty heavy duty. Yeah. Okay. So the next topic is kind of, you know, which we touched on with this, is diving. Okay. And so we're going to talk about humans as well as non-human animals. and adaptations they've evolved and how we achieve diving to depths. So first of all, when diving underwater, mammals have to hold their breath, right? Because they don't have gills, and we don't have gills. So this includes marine mammals who have evolved from terrestrial vertebrates like whales and dolphins, right? But they can dive for hours and over a mile deep, right? So there's adaptations that they possess for very long dives and also for that pressure of depths. So you guys are seeing this okay, right? The seals now? Yeah, okay. So, for example, an example from your textbook that's studied often for diving physiology are these Weddell seals, okay? And they can dive for over an hour, 80 minutes without surfacing for air and down, you know, a third of a mile deep, where pressure is 40 times what it is at sea level, 40 atmospheres of pressure. So very intense. So let's look at the adaptations that allow some of these species to dive for very prolonged amounts of time, and then also for pressure separately, okay? So first of all, during long dives, the brain and the heart constantly need oxygen, right? So we have to make sure we're providing oxygen for those tissues, right? What types of cells that we've talked about do not need to have oxygen present all the time?
Glycolytic muscle fibers.
Glycolytic muscles, for example, do not need oxygen all the time, right? So skeletal muscles can use creatine phosphatase and glycolysis to produce ATP to keep going instead of relying on oxygen, right? So you can kind of cut those off from oxygen for some time and just divert those oxygen stores to the brain. There's also parts of the body we can kind of just let stay in a bit of a state of stasis where metabolism is basically shut down for a bit. So basically we can achieve this by constricting blood vessels, right? So we've talked about how smooth muscle and various kind of arterioles can be constricted to cut off blood flow through those areas, especially when they're connecting to areas like skeletal muscles, okay? This also means that all the lactic acid fermentation that's happening in those muscles is also going to be cut off from rejoining the general circulation and keeps that acidity away from the brain and other vital organs. Okay. Other adaptations. So some of these diving mammals just have more blood. Okay, so this, for example, is a comparison of the amount of blood in humans and these Weddell seals. And you can see that the seals have 3 times more blood in their bodies than do humans. So if you saturate all the hemoglobin at the cells at the ocean surface, right, they're going to be carrying a lot more oxygen in their bodies. They also contain more hemoglobin per unit of blood. Okay, so those red blood cells, remember how we talked about, what did I say, 35% or so of your red blood cells are hemoglobin? Well, it's going to be a much higher percentage in some of these diving species. They also have extra blood stored in their spleen. So spleen, amongst a couple of other functions, stores blood cells. So they're not only do they typically have more blood circulating, right, but they also are able to store extra red blood cells. And so for kind of more transient periods of time, they can then increase the hematocrit content of their blood. They have more myoglobin in their muscles, so about 10 times more, right? So even though you're cutting off the supply of fresh oxygen to those muscles, the muscles are already storing a lot of oxygen. So for a while, they're able to produce ATP via oxidative means, right? So they have about 10 times more myoglobin than we do in their muscles, which makes them almost black as a result, just from how densely packed they are with this. So altogether, these various adaptations allow these animals to store about 6 to 7 times more oxygen per kilogram of their bodies than in terrestrial mammals. So highly specialized for this. Okay, and by being able to store this excess oxygen in their bodies, it allows for another important event to take place, which is that these species actually exhale before they dive, right? So if you think about you guys, if you're diving in a pool, right, to go down to the bottom, you're normally taking in a breath of air and then diving, right? Well, as we said, that air is going to get compressed by the increased pressures, and that can have negative results if you were to take it to depth, right? To a point where that pressure would cause increased nitrogen to be entering your blood. And we'll talk about that again as the bends, right? So these species want to avoid the bends. So what they do is they actually exhale, so they don't have so much air in their lungs. Instead, it's all bound up to the hemoglobin and the myoglobin. So you can see that between a human and a Weddell seal, we have very different proportions of where the oxygen is stored and the total amount of oxygen storage, right? So first of all, you can see that the seals store a total of almost 26 liters versus our 2 liters of oxygen. So huge difference there. Don't memorize the numbers, just realize this is an order of magnitude higher in the seals than humans, right? But you can also see that very little of the oxygen is in their lungs. It's kind of that residual volume of their lungs after they've exhaled. Most of it is in their blood and also their muscles, versus in us, a large portion of the oxygen is in our lungs, and obviously also a lot in blood, but the lungs is just a very large percentage versus the seals. Make sense? Okay. Now, if we look across people, remember we talked about how all people are not the same, and we do have all these kind of differences across populations. We talked about some of the native Greenlanders having genes that confer the ability to burn brown adipose tissue as adults, which typical adults don't have much of. Well, this is another example of another interesting kind of gene variant. These are Biol people in Southeastern Asia, okay, that have lived a nomadic existence on houseboats for thousands of years, okay? And so basically the populations live in oceanic conditions, and most of their foraging is basically then catching fish from the ocean. They've actually evolved larger spleens, right? Because again, these are red blood cell reservoirs, and so they are able to dive for much longer periods of time than our typical humans. They could dive to 70 meters, and some of these individuals, they spend 60% of their workday underwater, so they're diving constantly, right? And this has been happening for a very long time. So there's this paper that came out a couple of years ago where they were comparing the genes of very related populations, some that tend to be very terrestrial versus these Biol peoples that tend to dive a lot, and they found some mutations here that allow for some of these differences in the spleen, for example. Okay. Let's see, among other adaptations that you see across animal species, we also see compressible air chambers. That's not something we saw in people, right? As those animals exhale, they're actually able to compress their air chambers over here, right? And maybe this is part of the exhalation process because it's going to increase that pressure and get rid of the air from their lungs. So as the remaining air over here is compressed, those air chambers compress with it, and so they're not going to be as damaged from these dives. And it might prevent alveoli from collapsing at moderate depths, may prevent thoracic damage. Human lungs, we don't do this, right? When we're diving down, we maintain our lungs being expanded, right? Because we're taking in air from our dive tanks, right? And so you can kind of imagine this. So if we go down from one pressure, one atmosphere of pressure, right, to 2 atmospheres of pressure, what's going to happen in our lungs to maintain our lungs being expanded?
They'll expand more to combat that increase in pressure? Well,
we want to maintain the expansion, right? And if you have 1 atmosphere to 2 atmospheres, right, it's going to take this air and it's going to compress it to half as large a space, right? Because of the doubling the atmosphere. So what are you going to do to maintain this expansion of your lungs?
Take in more compressed air.
I'm sorry, what was that, Greta?
Could you just take in more compressed air?
Right, you take in more compressed air. You take in twice as much air for 2 atmospheres, right? So if you get down to 4 atmospheres, how much air do you take in?
4 times as much.
4 times as much, right? We talked about those seals going down to 40 atmospheres, right? That would be a lot of air, right? That's a lot of molecules of gases, right? And that's what creates the problems that lead to the bends. Okay, so here's a chart for scuba diving. Okay, so you can see over here, now I gotta minimize my window over here so I can see this chart. Okay, so at sea level, okay, here's 1 liter of air, okay, at 1 atmosphere. If you go down to 33 feet, you're now at 2 atmospheres. Okay, so now that 1 liter of air is compressed into 1/2 liter of space. So you'd have to take in 2 times as much air to fill your lungs. If you go down to 100 feet, which is the limit for open water diving certification, right, you are at...
Gigi.
What's that? Oh, you're at 4 atmospheres of pressure over here. And so that's going to compress it to 4. You're going to have 4 times as much air. Okay, you need special certification to dive beyond that. Okay, so at sea level, at that 1 atmosphere, right, we said oxygen is about 21% of gases, right, and some other trace gases, right? So nitrogen, partial pressure of nitrogen is about 0.78 at sea level. So as you go down 33 feet and you're at 2 atmospheres total, right, you're taking twice as much air into your lungs. So now, and at 100 feet, you're at 4 atmospheres. So you're taking 4 times as much air. And so the partial pressure is multiplied by the 2 or by the 4, right, by the total atmospheres of pressure. Because remember, this is a partial pressure of the total. So at 100 feet down, you're taking in 4 times 0.78. So you have 3.12 atmospheres of nitrogen partial pressure in your lungs, right? So a lot of nitrogen. So the bends, decompression sickness, okay? Remember, how well did nitrogen dissolve in water? Not very well, right? It was only half of that for oxygen, and oxygen was already much less able to dissolve than carbon dioxide, right? But it wasn't 0, right? There was a solubility for nitrogen. It could dissolve to some degree, right? So normally there's not much nitrogen dissolved, even though it comprises such a big amount of the air, such a big proportion of the air. But it's so insoluble that it doesn't dissolve in large quantities, right? But now we're going to depths, and so we have much more nitrogen in your lungs. So we're starting to scale up how much of that nitrogen gets into your blood, okay? And what happens is when you now start reversing your progress, you start going back up from depths, right? And the pressure starts decreasing. That nitrogen wants to get out of your blood fast because, again, it's not very soluble, right? And what happens, it precipitates out of blood quickly and creates nitrogen bubbles, okay, as it leaves the blood because it's coming out so quickly. And those nitrogen bubbles, right, those gas bubbles, they can coalesce in the joints and cause a lot of pain. If they enter the nervous system, they can disrupt the functioning of the brain, impairing thinking, causing dizziness, impairing vision, right? And if there's enough bubbles in places where they're blocking, for example, the passage of blood through various capillary beds, then that can kill you, can lead to death. That's why when divers dive to deep depths, right? So anything beyond, well, it's been a while since I did my open water certification. Beyond like 40 feet or so, you're going to have to start ascending slowly and taking breaks at different levels, because otherwise you will experience decompression sickness. So you kind of, if you're down to 100, right, you have to come up to like 70 for a little while, then up to 40 for a little while, allow the nitrogen to leave the blood gradually, okay? Oxygen and other gases can theoretically also cause decompression sickness, but they're less apt to do so just because of their properties of how they dissolve. They dissolve a little more readily in the blood, and so they don't come out of solution as readily. And so they don't form these gas bubbles as readily. So it's really the nitrogen that presents the problem of decompression sickness, okay? We also have much less oxygen dissolved in the blood, right? It's a lower percentage, much lower percentage of the atmosphere. So what can you do? Well, to prevent decompression sickness, one thing we can do is dive on pure oxygen, right? So in this case, the entire alveolar surface is left free for oxygen diffusion, right? So a lot of oxygen can come in. There's no nitrogen taking space. It's very efficient, right? You don't actually need nitrogen in your air to survive. You just need to get oxygen. The nitrogen is considered inert in there, right? Because there's no nitrogen, it doesn't enter your blood. So when you ascend, you reduce the chance of the bends because the nitrogen is not going to form bubbles, right? So, but you have to be very careful because what do we talk about oxygen doing before? How can it be dangerous? The name of this thing kind of comes from the term oxygen.
Oxidative damage or
Yeah,
something?
it can cause massive oxidative damage to your tissues. Oxygen is dangerous, right? We need it for producing ATP. Remember, we talked about how, the brain wants to minimize the amount of oxygen used. This is one of the hypotheses for why the brain relies on glucose and ketone bodies rather than fatty acids or proteins, because it would use much more oxygen for ATP production in the brain. It causes much more oxidative damage to the brain if you were to use these other metabolic fuels. So yeah, if you have a lot of oxygen dissolved in your blood, taking up the space that nitrogen would normally, that can cause problems, right? So here's a little curve here this is from a medical physiology textbook that I kind of stole for the class here. And so what you have is you have your typical oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve, right? So once partial pressures of oxygen are high enough, like in the lungs, you saturate the hemoglobin fully, right? And under normal circumstances, you don't have much oxygen dissolved in the blood here, right? But as you start diving deeper on pure oxygen, what you see is that you start increasing the atmospheres of pressure, which causes much more dissolved oxygen to be present in your blood, right? It doesn't affect the oxygen hemoglobin curve because you've already saturated the hemoglobin to 100% under normal circumstances in the lungs, right? So that is not changed, but the amount of oxygen in the blood is. And so this other line up here shows the summation of the oxygen on the hemoglobin and the oxygen dissolved in the blood. And it just shows how that can get to very high levels over here, at which point you're reaching oxygen poisoning levels, okay? So you start forming reactive oxygen-free radicals, superoxides, peroxides, etc., that cause massive oxidative stress to the tissues, damaging them, which could again cause pulmonary damage, seizures, comas, death, etc., just like the bends would. So it doesn't really solve that problem in a way, okay? So another approach that people take for diving deep, especially in professions where you have to do some sort of salvage work or deep sea repairs on some sort of vessels or things like that, they dive on oxygen helium mixes, okay? So this prevents you having too much nitrogen in your lungs, but also prevents having too much oxygen in your lungs, because oxygen remains kind of a smaller percentage of the mix, and instead what you have is a lot of helium. So this is called heliox. And so it avoids the oxygen toxicity. It avoids the bends because helium is actually almost insoluble in the blood. So it'll enter the blood even much less so than with nitrogen, even at very high pressures that you experience at those low depths. And so very little enters the blood, so very little leaves of the blood again, so it doesn't cause these bubbles to form. A kind of a fun little side fact is that the folks on the surface that are communicating via radio with these individuals have to have helium descramblers that lower the pitch of the voices of the divers, because those of you that have been inhaling helium balloons at parties as a gag know that it will raise the pitch of your voice by its effects on your vocal cords. And so, so they have to descramble these Mickey Mouse voices at the surface. So this doesn't cause narcosis also, yeah. Okay, so that's depths. Any questions about that before we switch to high altitude? Okay, so high altitude. So we've gone from really high pressures at very low depths to sea level being at 1 atmosphere. Then we could go up, 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 up. And now what's going to happen is that as we increase our altitude, we're going to decrease pressure. Not as rapidly as we increase pressure going down, but it'll still decrease as we go up. So here's Mount Everest, right? The peak is almost at 30,000 feet, which is kind of the height of jet aircraft. There's some birds that fly at the height of commercial aircraft or even higher, right? So they have to have some sort of adaptations, right? So how do they do this, right? So there's a few different things. One of them, remember I talked to you guys about how the breathing, the blood versus oxygen-filled medium in birds is different. It's a hybrid of what we learned about before, right? We learned about unidirectional, countercurrent, tidal, right? Well, birds, they're kind of like us, right? They breathe air in and out, right? That's a tidal ventilation, but then they have a special adaptation that makes it a little closer to cross current than what we employ, okay? They have a more extensive respiratory pathway for their air than we do. So first of all, they have air sacs at either ends of their lungs, okay? And they use these air sacs to minimize the mixing of fresh and oxygen-depleted CO2-rich air. Okay, so you have two separate kind of lungs, you could think of it, two separate air sacs, okay? So when you breathe in, fresh air moves into the posterior set of air sacs at the back. So it comes in out here, okay? And what happens is that from here, fresh air then moves into these parabronchi in the lungs. This is where they're going to meet the blood capillaries. So those blood capillaries are going to be meeting fresh air that has not been mixed with depleted air like it would in our lungs, right? And it moves from there, gives off the oxygen to those capillary beds, picks up CO2, and moves from there into these anterior air sacs. During exhalation, air then moves from these anterior sacs and back out of the body, okay? So it's a way to prevent the mixing of the fresh air and the stale air. So we call this cross-current circulation, okay? So you can see the path of the oxygen over here into those posterior air sacs, then it moves this way to the anterior sacs and out, and here's the flow of the blood. It's not in the same direction, it's not in the countercurrent direction. What it is, it goes across this. So these capillary beds, these different capillaries move across those parabronchi over here, so hence it's called cross-current circulation, okay? Again, this is then taking that oxygen, bringing it to its tissues, to those mitochondria for ATP production, okay? So this is just a diagram from the book of that cross-current circulation. Remember, our concurrent or unidirectional ventilation could get us up to about 50 units of air. Our countercurrent could do about 75. Our tidal ventilation was about 55, so a bit closer to unidirectional. Here you can see that we're getting up to more like 65 or so. So it's kind of a hybrid, you know. It's better than we can do, but not as efficient as the fish. But again, it's still moving in gas, in and out gases, so it's more efficient that way than is breathing liquid. So that's one way that you can extract more oxygen from the air, but air is still extremely, extremely rarefied at those high altitudes, right? So there's other adaptations that probably play an even bigger role, right? And one of those is kind of probably increased oxygen binding affinity of the hemoglobin in some of these species. And so, you know, scientists can look at that. So here's the percentage of hemoglobin saturation at different partial pressures of oxygen down here, okay? I'll move my little zoom controls out of the way here so I can see this. Okay, so you can see this is just measuring it in millimeters of mercury or kilopascals. As you get up towards that 100, right, that we talked about, you start saturating the blood, the hemoglobin of all these species, right? But this is a little underneath where we would normally be at sea level, right? Where we were at, remember, 100 millimeters of mercury here. The highest value is 80 millimeters of mercury over here, okay? And what you can see is that a couple of these species, these bar-headed geese, and for some reason penguins, emperor penguins, I'm not sure why, have very high binding affinity. And so at those fairly relatively low pressures, right, This is actually 10 kilopascals. Normally we're at 101 kilopascals. So I think this is actually, I think I must have been mistaken. I think I was talking about 100 bar. This is millimeters of mercury. So this is actually much lower than normal saturation. And what you see is even at these very low levels over here, okay, these species are able to almost saturate their hemoglobin versus other species like over here, these domestic ducks cannot do so at that pressure. That's normally an unloading kind of level of pressure. Okay? Okay. In terms of us, when we go to high altitudes, you know, we're not at all adapted to that, right? So we oftentimes would rely on oxygen supplementation. So these mountaineers that go up on Everest, you know, oftentimes you'll see them wearing a little oxygen tank, and you know, they're breathing in normally pure oxygen because at this point, you know, the pressure's so low, you're not putting in a ton of oxygen into your system, right? They're trying to maintain their oxygen saturation of their hemoglobin. Pressure is much lower than 1 atmosphere, so the partial pressure of oxygen is much lower than 0.21. Right? At rest, we said the body doesn't need the full 0.21 because we have a little bit of a reservoir for active activity, right? But during vigorous exercise, this is near our limit to get sufficient oxygen to our tissues, right? And so these mountaineers, when they're climbing up these mountains, right, they're unable to get sufficient oxygen to those mitochondria if they're breathing the air that's up there. On top of Mount Everest, the partial pressure is about 0.3 atmosphere. So you can see how the pressure is not dropping nearly as quickly as it increased when you went down into depths underwater. But at this point, you're at less than a third of normal pressure. So you're already down here as your starting point, right? Remember that during exercise, and when you're starting up around 0.2, 0.21%, you're barely getting enough to your mitochondria. So here, you would not. Your tissues would be starving, okay? If you're climbing on pure oxygen, okay, then you got lots of O2 available. And again, there's lots of space to exhale the CO2. So it's not the same problems you have when diving, right? This is very rarefied air, very uncompressed air at low pressure. So lots of spaces to exhale carbon dioxide into. At really high altitudes, when you're above like 50,000 feet, so remember we said jet aircraft, Mount Everest, some of these birds, they're about 30,000 feet. So now if you're at like 50,000 feet, so even higher, the pressure outside the lungs is too low for the respiratory movement of gases, basically. It's not going to function, right? So jet aircraft, military jet aircraft, when you see people up high, what do they have to have?
An oxygen mask.
They have to have oxygen masks, and what else?
A pressurized cabin.
Yeah, pressurized cabin or pressurized suits, right? So we have to maintain pressure, okay? Because look, so at this altitude up here, 50,000 feet, even breathing pure oxygen, it's just those oxygen molecules are so spaced apart that you will not get enough to maintain arterial oxygen saturation, right? You would die without a pressure suit or a pressurized cabin, even if you're breathing pure oxygen. Just the oxygen molecules are just not there. At that point, you're dealing with a low concentration, okay? If you're breathing air, which is only 0.21% oxygen, this would happen at a much lower kind of altitude normally for people, okay? So this is talking about high altitude pilots wearing pressure suits over here. And if you're at a high altitude, over like 60,000 feet, your body fluids actually start evaporating from your body because you know the density of those molecules out there is so low that you're basically, it's kind of like diffusion of those molecules out of your body. It's moving, you know, from your body into the external environment and dissipating. So it's basically evaporating from your body, and you would die. Okay, so this just shows how breathing pure oxygen over here will not work without a pressure suit over here. This is basically showing something similar to this. Okay. Okay, so that's basically what we have time for today. Do you guys have any last minute questions before I stop today's lecture? We just have a few more slides in this PowerPoint about high elevation, and we're going to talk about human adaptations to high altitude next time, okay, from different peoples in different parts of the world that have adapted to high altitude. If you don't have any more questions, well, feel free to stick around for office hours. And if you don't have any more questions, then have a good weekend. Remember to turn in the results and discussion homework by the end of today. Remember that Monday you have to turn in the metabolism homework. There's no quiz or anything on Monday. We'll have lecture again Monday morning, and then we'll talk about the lab assignment Monday at 1. Okay? All right. Well, have a good day, have a good weekend, and I'll see you guys next time.